keep awake. This is the word of God for you, the people of God. Thanks be to God. In Charles Dickens' classic story, A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge is visited by three spirits: the spirit of Christmas past, the spirit of Christmas present, and finally the spirit of Christmas future. The spirit of Christmas future, hooded in black, looking like the Grim Reaper, shows Scrooge a terrifying vision of Christmas yet to come. On Christmas future, wealthy businessmen discuss the death of one of their colleagues. They're so unaffected by his death that they only want to show up to the funeral if there's free lunch provided. In the slums of London, some of Scrooge's servants are pawning off valuable items they stole from him. Scrooge is disturbed by what he sees. No one seems to care about this man's death. And so he asks the spirit to show him any emotion over the death of this unknown man. And the only emotion he can show him comes from a couple who celebrate with joy the death of this man because he held them deeply in debt. Scrooge asks then, is there any tenderness from this man's death? And the only tenderness comes from Bob Cratchit and his family as they mourn the loss of Tiny Tim. All of this is too much for Scrooge to bear, and he begs the spirit to reveal the identity of this man whose death no one seems to care about. And so Scrooge immediately finds himself in a graveyard in front of a freshly dug grave with the tombstone bearing the name of the unknown man, Ebenezer Scrooge. On this first Sunday of Advent, we begin with Christmas future. Just as Jesus came into our world the first time, fulfilling promises that were made to generations of those who were faithful to Israel's God, we are promised that Jesus will come again. We are promised that just as there was a first Christmas, where Jesus arrives in our world and lives among us, there will be a last Christmas, where Jesus will come once again into our world and will live with us forever. But Christmas future depicted in our gospel reading this morning appears to be just as grim as the Christmas future that Scrooge sees. On Christmas past, Jesus comes into the world in the vulnerability of a little baby sleeping on the hay of a manger. But in Christmas future, Jesus comes riding on the clouds of heaven, in power and in glory with his angels, ready to judge the people of the world. On Christmas past, a star rises in the east to light the way for the Magi, so they can come and worship the newborn King. But on Christmas future, the sun and the moon no longer give their light, and the stars fall from heaven. On the first Christmas, prophecies of long ago are fulfilled, as Christ is born in Bethlehem. But on that last Christmas, no one knows the day or the hour. And because no one knows that day or hour, they're told to keep awake, so we don't miss that moment. This isn't the type of reading that we would expect on that first Sunday of Advent. Mark's story of Christmas future probably isn't the story we would tell our children huddled around an open fire. What we read this morning is the conclusion to a sermon given by Jesus on the Mount of Olives that's become known to scholars as Mark's Little Apocalypse. Mark's Little Apocalypse is all about the return of Jesus into our world. We Presbyterians don't talk much about the return of Christ. When Jesus said, "No one knows the day or the hour," we believed him. And if no one knows the day or the hour, why bother talking about it? We don't spend our time obsessing over when that day will arrive or reading over current events as signs of the coming apocalypse. We've been content to simply believe in the promise that Jesus will come again. And so we begin Advent with the second coming because our vision of the future changes how we live in the present. Our vision of Christmas future changes how we live in Christmas present. When Scrooge sees the headstone with his name on it, he falls down before the spirit of Christmas yet to come and begs him, "Assure me that I may yet change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life." Scrooge is then returned to his bed on the present Christmas morning. But the vision of Christmas future changes him. No longer does Scrooge say, "Bah, humbug," but instead he shouts throughout the streets of London, "Merry Christmas." The former miser now gives out huge sums of money to people he meets. He promises to become a benefactor for a charity in London. He brings a huge Christmas turkey to Bob Cratchit and his family. The day after Christmas, Scrooge remains true to his word and gives Bob a sizable raise and promises to take care of his family. Tiny Tim, who in the premonition of the future dies, now lives because Scrooge takes it upon himself to take care of him. This vision of the future changes Scrooge. Scrooge is visited by three spirits, but it's this last spirit that shows him Christmas future, that changes how he lives in the present. His vision of the future awakens him to a changed life in the here and now. Like Scrooge, our vision of Christmas future is meant to be transformational for how we live in Christmas present. We begin on the first Sunday of Advent with a vision of the future so that, like Scrooge, we know how we might live in the present. Scrooge's vision was one of fear and terror. Fear over what his future holds is what motivates Scrooge to change his life. And our reading this morning might appear at first glance to be one of fear and terror. But what we see in Mark's gospel isn't meant to induce fear. It's not meant to make us look away in terror. Rather, it's meant to give us hope. It might be hard to see hope in this passage. After all, what we read this morning was known as Mark's little apocalypse. What's all that hopeful about an apocalypse? There's a growing sense of darkness that overshadows this passage. The sun and the moon no longer give their light, and the stars fall from heaven. The powers in heaven will be shaken, and cataclysmic events become normal. The despair and gloom of Mark 13 increases in intensity. But just as the darkness threatens to overtake all light, just as despair threatens to become the only emotion available, just as cataclysmic events threaten to destroy the whole world, Christ comes. The hope of this passage is that Christ enters our world. Christ doesn't enter a perfect world, but rather one that's filled with darkness and despair. The hope of Advent is that Christ comes not only into our world 2,000 years ago in the form of a baby, but he's promised to come into our world again, and is continually coming into our world even now. In hope, we look for signs of Christ's appearance among us now. One of my favorite quotes comes from Cornel West, who says, "I cannot be an optimist, but I am a prisoner of hope." Optimism says that everything around us is perfect the way it is, and nothing needs to change. Optimism says we should continue down the same path we've been going. Hope, on the other hand, acknowledges the reality of the world. It acknowledges the darkness and despair around us. Hope acknowledges our world is one of growing darkness, like Mark's little apocalypse. That during Advent, this is literally true as the days get shorter and darker. And the darkness of the season reminds us that there is still a world of growing darkness around us. But it's against this backdrop that Christ says, "When you see these things, you know that I am near. You know that I am coming into the world." Hope says that despite of all of what we see that says the contrary, there is something new that is possible for our world. Hope is that into the darkness of our world, Christ is coming. Advent is about being that prisoner of hope. It's about being honest about the world around us. It's about hoping for the Christ who came into our world once, despite its darkness and imperfection, and hoping for that same coming of Christ in our world even now. Being awakened to this vision of hope and the vision of Christmas future transforms how we live in the present. If we have hope that Christ is the one who is always coming into our world, we are to keep awake. Keep awake. Keep expecting Jesus to appear in our midst. We don't know the day or the hour, but Jesus has promised he will come among us when we least expect it. So keep awake to the ways that Jesus might appear in your life. Our vision of hope of Christmas future changes how we live in the present by awakening us to the ways that Christ is coming into our world even now. There's a fictional story about the Russian composer and pianist Ignacy Jan Paderewski. One evening he was set to perform at a large concert hall. This was a formal occasion. The audience was dressed in tuxedos and in evening gowns. And among this well-dressed crowd was a mother with her fidgety 9-year-old son. The mother had been trying unsuccessfully to get him to play piano. And so she thought if she could bring him to hear the great Paderewski, it would spark his interest and desire to play piano. And so they found their seat in the auditorium and they waited for the concert to begin. While they waited, this mother was talking with her friends. The boy squirmed with boredom. So this young boy decided to walk off and explore his surroundings. And as he wandered, he found a door with a sign that read, "No admittance," which he decided didn't apply to him, and he walked through. Meanwhile, the mother was still talking with her friends when the lights dimmed and the curtains opened. The mother stopped talking and turned back to the seat where her son had been sitting to find that it was empty. Then she saw a terrifying sight. Her son sitting at the piano reserved for the great Paderewski. But her dismay didn't end there as he began to play chopsticks. The audience, who had come to hear one of the greatest pianists and composers of their time, jeered at the boy. Voices began demanding him to get off stage. Then suddenly Paderewski appeared from backstage, and a hush fell over the crowd as they waited to see what he would do. He said nothing but strode over to the boy, who was still unfazed by the crowd and still playing chopsticks. Paderewski then reached his arms around him and began to play a counter melody with him. And as they played together, Paderewski whispered in the boy's ear, "Keep going. Don't quit, son. Keep on playing. Don't quit. I'm right here." This Advent season, may you be filled with the hope of Christmas future, that the one who has come is coming even now. May hope awaken you to the closeness of Christ, especially when the darkness grows. May the vision of the future awaken you to the presence of Christ among us now. And may you hear his voice say to you, "Don't quit. I'm right here. Keep going." Amen. I invite you to rise as you are able as we sing hymn number 8, "Lift Up Your Heads, Ye Mighty Gates."